Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone. Welcome everyone to another Ref Brandon and the Todd family YouTube video. We have not gone live. Figured since we're doing another top 10 countdown this week, I'd go ahead and come on here and do it live. Hopefully, we'll have good connection throughout the video. So if anybody wants to chime in and join the conversation, please feel free to do so. This week's top 10 is another wrestling related top 10 this week because of my friend James from work. We're going to be doing top 10 all-time tag teams, and this list is going to be fun because I've always been a big fan of tag team wrestling, especially back when I was a young man. So, of course, when you're only doing top 10, somebody is going to get left off. So after I give my top 10, I'll run off a few tag teams that did not make the list, but for one reason or another, I enjoyed watching them as a tag team. But before I get into my top 10 list, I wanted to say for all you college football fans out there, and I know there are some college football fans out there, that they announced that the Clemson and Georgia game is going to be starting at 7:30 coming up on the 4th of September. And now that they have announced the game time, they went ahead and released the early prediction for the point spread. And right now it's Clemson by 3 points, which is about what I expected one way or the other. I've been saying this whole time that I'd be surprised if either team was favored by more than 4 or 5 points. It's Clemson by 3. Of course, it's May, so that'll change 5,000 times by September. But coming up one day, hopefully next week, I'm going to try to explain why I have not picked a winner yet and why I'm having trouble picking a winner and why I'm having trouble deciding who I think is going to win the game. I know one day last week, I think it was last Sunday, I went ahead and gave some of my early season thoughts on some key factors that both teams need to win the game, but I have not yet got into why I personally am having trouble deciding who I think is going to win the game. But we'll do that coming up one day next week. And if you are a wrestling fan, don't forget we've already did, I believe, top 10 all-time babyface wrestlers, top 10 all-time heel wrestlers, top 10 all-time masked wrestlers, top 10 all-time just in-ring wrestlers. And then I also had a video where I just ran down some of my favorite all-time gimmicks. I didn't list them in order 1 through 10. It was just some of the gimmicks that I've liked in all my years of wrestling. But also, when you watch this video, I try to do a top 10 once a week. I know I just rambled off 5 or 6 different ones that I've did, and they were all wrestling related. But the top 10 countdown does not have to be wrestling related. I don't mind when it is. But when I first started this back in March, my very first top 10 countdown was top 10 all-time candy bars, and that was based on all-time sales. And then I did top 10 all-time TV comedies, which was, of course, my opinion. And then I started taking thoughts and suggestions on top 10. And so far, about the last 5 or 6 that I've gotten have been about wrestling. I've also did a top 10 all-time Major League Baseball players. So anything that's sports related, I have no problem talking about it. Even if it's not sports related, I have no problem talking about it, which is why I did top 10 all-time candy bars and top 10 all-time TV comedies. Anything that's fun and brings up conversation, I'm all about. But hey, James, thanks for tuning in, man. I'm just fixing to get started. I was trying to wait a few minutes to see if anybody would jump on here when we get ready to do our top 10 all-time tag teams. Of course, this is my opinion, so opinions are going to differ, but I think every team on this list is going to be a team everybody has heard of because it's all-time tag team. So there's no way you can be a top 10 all-time tag team and somebody hasn't heard of you. But without further ado, we'll go ahead and get into my opinion of the top 10 all-time tag teams. Of course, this is not based on one company, and it's not based on one generation. It's just all-time tag teams. Number 10 on my list is the Nasty Boys. Now, of course, I was about 7 years old when I first started watching wrestling, and I instantly fell in love with the Nasty Boys. Now, I'm not going to take up all your time by running down each team's credentials. If you're curious as to, how many years each team wrestled, how many tag team belts each team won based on promotions, you can always get on Google and look that stuff up. But number 10 on my list is the Nasty Boys. Number 9 on my list of top 10 all-time tag teams is Harlem Heat. Harlem Heat's another phenomenal, great tag team. James, we're going to talk about the Rock and Sock Connection coming up here in a few minutes. But number 8 on my list is the Hardy Boys. Now, let me say that the Hardy Boys never were my cup of tea. For whatever reason, I've just never liked them, whether they're a tag team. And right now, of course, Matt's AEW, Jeff is still WWE, and I just don't like them as singles wrestlers. For whatever reason, I have just never been a big fan of Matt or Jeff Hardy. But you look at their credentials as a tag team, and even though I personally don't like them, they were an amazing, amazing tag team. Number 7 on my list was Demolition. Now, of course, Demolition for the longest time held the record for longest tag team title reign in the WWE until a few years back when New Day beat it. But Demolition is number 7 on my list. And number 6 on my list was the Fabulous Freebirds. And I also got a couple side notes on the Fabulous Freebirds just to see if anybody knows this. But they originally debuted in 1979. And their music was written and performed by Michael P.S. Hayes, who was, of course, one of the original members of the Fabulous Freebirds. And you also, to this day, because of the Freebirds, have the Freebird rule, where if a tag team has 3 members, you can take turns deciding which 2 is going to wrestle and defend the tag team titles. And it's called the Freebird rule because the Fabulous Freebirds started doing that back in the day. But anyway, on to my point. 1979, when they debuted, their theme song was written and performed by Michael P.S. Hayes, and they pretty much are the originators, if you want to call it the originators, of wrestling theme songs. If you go back in the day from the 60s and 70s and watch wrestling, 99% of them didn't have music. It was just quiet noise, and you would hear the ring announcer announce their name, and you'd hear the crowd booing and cheering, and that was it. But when the Freebirds got together in 1979, Michael P.S. Hayes wrote and performed their song. So we can all thank Michael P.S. Hayes for wrestling having theme songs. Otherwise, we may still be back in the day of wrestlers coming out to boos and cheers and nothing else. And we're also doing this live. James, and you can't comment on this because I've already told you this at work, but Michael Hayes, of course, was a stage name. It was not his real name. But there's a reason why he was Michael P.S. Hayes and not just Michael Hayes, and that's because the P.S. stood for something. Now, I'm not going to tell you what it stood for, but since we're doing this live, anybody besides James, because James knows the answer, can easily get on Google and find out what Michael P.S. Hayes stood for. And James, Chris just called you old. He said he didn't know you were that old. That old. He's saying you're old, James. Anyway, before I get into my top 5, I'll recap 10 through 6. 10 was the Nasty Boys. 9 was Harlem Heat. 8 was the Hardy Boys. 7 was Demolition. And number 6 was the Fabulous Freebirds. Before I get into the top 5, if you have not yet subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do so. Don't forget, when we get to subscriber number 500, we'll be having a giveaway. Hopefully, we'll be there coming up in the next couple of weeks. But I don't think I've said yet that when we get to 500, we're going to be having a giveaway. But if you've been watching the channel, you know back when we got to 100 subscribers, I just wrote all the names down and drew a name out of a hat. That was easy. But 500 is a lot to write down, so I'm not doing that. So what I'm doing this time is my wife is just going to pick a random comment that somebody has left on the page. It can be about any topic at any time about anything. So in order to win, you can't just subscribe. You have to subscribe and actually leave comments on the page. So the more comments you leave, the better chance you have of winning when we get to 500 subscribers. Now, on to my top 5, and these are going to be 5 tag teams that everybody has heard of. Number 5 on my list was the Steiner Brothers. I was always a big fan of the Steiner Brothers. Of course, when they broke up, Rick was always basically pretty much a mid-card guy on his own. But Scott, of course, he dyed his hair blonde, dyed his goatee blonde, and become Big Papa Pump. So I also liked him as a singles wrestler. But the Steiner Brothers as a tag team were amazing. Chris, there you go. The Steiner Brothers are in the top 5. Number 4 on my list was the Rock and Sock Connection. I always just liked the name, first of all, Rock and Sock, and then The Rock and Mick Foley were an amazing tag team. It would have been amazing to see what else they could have done had they been together for a longer period of time. But, of course, they were both mainly singles wrestlers. Number 3 on my list was the Midnight Express. Number 2 on my list was the Rock and Roll Express. And in my opinion, the best tag team of all time, hands down. Now, like I said earlier, I'm not going to sit here and tell you all the tag team titles they won, all the places they wrestled, and all that kind of stuff. You can look that up if you do so choose. But if you're my age or older, you've seen plenty of their matches. Started years and years and years ago. They had Paul Ellering as their manager, but they were great with him. They were also great without him. But number 1 on my list for all-time best tag team was the Legion of Doom or the Road Warriors, whichever one you want to call them. And now I'm going to sit here and run down some of the teams that did not make the list, but I always just enjoyed them for one reason or another. And one was Fire and Ice, just because Fire and Ice included Ice Train, and I was a big fan of Ice Train back in the days of WCW. Another one was Vicious and Delicious. And if you don't know who that was Scott Norton and Marcus Alexander Bagwell back in the days of WCW. And I was always a big fan of Marcus Bagwell, and then I was a big fan of Buff Bagwell when he became Buff Bagwell. But they had a tag team called Vicious and Delicious. So not only were they a great tag team, I just think Vicious and Delicious was a great name for a tag team. And Chris, the Dudley Boys were not on my list. I thought they were, but they didn't. That just goes to show how many great tag teams there were back in the day. But just like I said about the Hardy Boys, I was not a big fan of the Hardy Boys, but even though they've just never been my cup of tea, they're still a great tag team. I feel the same about the Dudley Boys. The Dudley Boys, for whatever reason, have just never been my cup of tea, whether it's Ring of Honor, ECW, WCW, TNA, WWE. I've just, for whatever reason, never liked the Dudley Boys. They were a great tag team. They just were not my cup of tea. Another team that I always liked, and they were basically glorified jobbers back in the day, but that was Thunder and Lightning, just because when they debuted, I was, I think, 8 years old, and I thought Thunder and Lightning was a great name for a tag team. But like I said, they were basically glorified jobbers, so they weren't around probably not even a year. I just liked the name Thunder and Lightning. Another team was Beer Money. Now, my wife was a big fan of Beer Money, basically just because my wife was a big fan of James Storm. Anything James Storm does, she's all about. But they weren't top 10, but they were a great tag team. And James, the Natural Disasters, they were some big guys. I was talking to a friend of mine named Randy earlier today, and he's younger than I am. But he said he was a huge wrestling fan. And I asked him if he'd ever heard of the McGuire brothers, and he hadn't. And I told him they were the world's largest tag team. The McGuire brothers combined, if I'm not mistaken, were over a combined weight of 1,400 pounds, I believe. But the McGuire brothers were actually twins. But you can get on Google and type up the McGuire brothers, and it's got a picture of both of them sitting on a motorcycle. But they were so big, all you could see was the wheels. You couldn't see the body of the bike at all. But the McGuire brothers were the biggest tag team ever, and I'm pretty sure they were combined at 1,400 pounds. But the natural disasters, earthquake and typhoon, were also big guys. And, of course, when they broke up, Typhoon turned good and changed his name to Tugboat. And then, of course, his biggest claim to fame was when he became the Shockmaster in WCW. That gimmick fell apart quickly. You can always get on YouTube and type up Botchamania, and one of the first things you'll see is his gimmick when he was the Shockmaster in WCW. Another team that barely missed the list was America's Most Wanted. Now I'm going back in the days of TNA, but they were another great tag team in the early days of TNA. That's why a lot of people, unless you're a hardcore wrestling fan, don't know who they are, because when they were a tag team, TNA was just getting another team that barely missed my list. And it is also because of the name, just like Thunder and Lightning and Vicious and Delicious. But that was the Head Shrinkers. I always thought, of course, again, like I said a while ago, I was about 7 or 8 years old, but I thought the Head Shrinkers was a phenomenal name for a tag team. But they were around back in the late 80s, early to mid 90s. And then also the British Bulldogs. Now, the British Bulldogs could have been in the top 10 had they been a tag team a lot longer than what they were, but they were still great nonetheless. And, of course, that was the British Bulldog and the Dynamite Kid. And another team that I wish could have been in the top 10, but they also weren't together long enough, and that was the Brain Busters. Now, of course, if you've watched wrestling for a long time, you know the Brain Busters was Arn Anderson and Tully Blanchard. Of course, they later on got back together as the Four Horsemen, but they were originally together as the Brain Busters. Great tag team, great name, 2 great wrestlers, but they just weren't together for a long enough period of time. And Chris, the Bushwhackers was the next team I was going to get into, because to this day, I can still picture myself doing this right here. Just like the Bushwhackers always did, because I always liked that gimmick. And believe it or not, those guys, I hope I made y'all's night when I did that for you. Hope that was very entertaining. But the Bushwhackers, believe it or not, are both like 70 years old, early 70s, and they're still wrestling. But, of course, they're over in New Zealand, so they're wrestling over in New Zealand, but they are still wrestling. And not many people know that they were actually famous before they came to what was then the WWF. They used to be the Sheep Herders a long time ago, back in the day, and they were bad guys. But then when they signed with WWF, they changed their name to the Bushwhackers, and they were good guys. And, of course, they were a great tag team, but they didn't really use them properly, so you never got to see the actual talent they had. But they were a great tag team. Another great tag team, in my opinion, that was not booked properly was the Beverly Brothers. Now, if you remember the Beverly Brothers, they were wrestlers for many years. One of them's name was Mike Enos, and one of them's name was Wayne Bloom. But as the Beverly Brothers, they were Bo and Blake, and their manager, of course, was the Genius. And back in the day, not many people knew that the Genius is Lanny Poffo, who, of course, is the brother of the Macho Man, Randy Savage. He pretty much had given up his in-ring career for the most part and just chose to be a manager. And his name was the Genius, and he come to the ring wearing a robe like he was graduating. And they were supposed to be these snobs, but if you go back on YouTube and watch them from about 95 or 96, they were a great tag team, but they just didn't book them right, so they didn't last very long. They were also together for a short time in WCW as the Wrecking Crew, But I was always a big fan of the Beverly Brothers, Bo and Blake Beverly. And of course, it was Mike Enos and Wayne Bloom, two great, great wrestlers. And the last team that I had to leave off my list was probably one of, if not my favorite all-time tag team. But when I was putting the list together, I thought, you know what? Even though I like those guys, they're just not top 10, even though, in my opinion, they're top 10. But I figured for the most part, most people wouldn't say they're top 10. And that was the ENC dynasty, which was Edge and Christian. And I can still to this day remember Edge coming out and saying, now, for the benefit of all of those, the flash photography, and they would do their pose. I always liked Edge and Christian, but of course they broke up, and they're both still wrestling now as single stars. Edge is still in WWE. Christian is now Christian Cage in AEW, which if you watched AEW Dynamite tonight, you've seen Christian Cage in the very first match of the evening. But I was always a big fan of the E and C dynasty, but I thought, well, I like them. They're not quite as good as the Nasty Boys. They're not as good as Harlem Heat. They weren't as good as the Hardy Boys. They certainly weren't as good as Demolition or the Freebirds. So I thought, well, if they're not good enough to be 10 through 6, they're not good enough to be in the top 5. But I was always a big fan of the ENC dynasty. And then another one that I didn't write down, but I also liked, was the American Males, which involved the aforementioned Marcus Alexander Bagwell. And he was also in the American Males tag team with Scotty Riggs. You liked them better with Gangrel. Me too, James. I liked Gangrel. Gangrel could have lasted a lot longer had they used him properly as well. Of course, he's still around today, still wrestling, but they could have used him better and should have used him better when he was in the WWE years ago. But Marcus Bagwell was part of the American Males when he was with Scotty Riggs. So he had Vicious and Delicious with Scott Norton, and he had the American Males with Scotty Riggs. And, of course, Marcus Bagwell also had a tag team with Two Cold Scorpio, and they were just called Marcus Bagwell and Two Cold Scorpio. They didn't have a tag team name. I actually seen them at the Civic Center when I was about 7 years old. So Marcus Bagwell, even though he later became Buff Bagwell, to me, he's known more as a tag team wrestler than a singles wrestler, because he had so many different tag team partners through the years. Now, Vicious and Delicious probably could have had some tag team title runs, but back in those days, that was back when promotions worked together, and Scott Norton had signed a contract with New Japan. So a lot of times when Vicious and Delicious were together, Scott Norton was overseas in Japan working for New Japan Pro Wrestling. Otherwise, Vicious and Delicious probably would have had some tag team title runs, at least one. But that's my opinion of the top 10 all-time tag teams. Hopefully you enjoyed it. If you got on here and watched late, please go back and watch the entire video. I've had a couple requests on what to do for my next top 10 countdown. I don't know if I'll do them next or if I'll skip around and do something else and then come back to them. So I'm not going to tell you what they are, but I have had a few requests for my next top 10. I try to do one per week. That way, if it's not sports related, it gives us a break from sports for a day. But if it is sports related or wrestling related, I have no problem with that. I try to talk about what anybody and everybody wants to talk about and discuss. But I got a question. Did you hear about the restaurant called Karma? It's a brand new restaurant. There's no menu. You get what you deserve. And that wraps it up for another Ref Brandon and the Todd family YouTube video for all you NASCAR fans out there. I'm going to try to get on here tomorrow and do my weekly NASCAR review. And it's going to be our review from the NASCAR race this past Sunday at the Monster Mile in Dover, Delaware. So if you're a NASCAR fan or know someone who is, please feel free to tell them to go ahead and like, comment, share, and subscribe, and get ready for tomorrow's video where we're going to recap the NASCAR race from over the weekend at the Monster Mile in Dover. And I'm still going to try to discuss the NBA playoffs on here, since, in my opinion, the NBA playoffs start this weekend. That +4, +1 stuff, whatever you choose to call it, to me is not the playoffs. The playoffs start when the playoffs start, not this 7 play 8, 9 play 10 stuff. That ain't the playoffs. So hopefully, if you're an NBA fan, we're going to be talking about the NBA coming up here in the next few days as well. But until next time, it's Ref Brandon saying, just like in pro wrestling, life can be over by the count of 3. Tell your friends and family how much you love them.